The watch wasn't worth anything. That's what they told him. That's what the lawyer read aloud in front of the whole family. And that's what his son-in-law repeated under his breath, with a smirk that Sterling Webb had to pretend he didn't see. One watch, 43 years of his father's life. And what the old man left him was a beat-up Elgin field watch that hadn't kept time since 1987. Sterling stood in the back of the room while his younger brother Brent collected the keys to the house, the deed to the ranch, and a check for $412,000. He stood there in his worn flannel shirt, with his hands in his pockets, and his dog, Cody, waiting outside in the truck, and he told himself it was fine. His father had made his choices. Men like his father always did. What Sterling didn't know, what none of them knew, was that inside the cracked leather back panel of that watch, folded so thin it felt like nothing, was a piece of paper that would change everything by morning. He'd driven 3 hours to get to Clarkton, Nebraska, and he turned around and drove 3 hours back the same night. Cody rode shotgun the whole way, the way he always did, a big, quiet German shepherd with one torn ear and eyes that seemed to track Sterling's mood better than any person ever had. When Sterling's jaw tightened on the highway outside of Omaha, Cody shifted in his seat and put his head against Sterling's shoulder without being asked. "I'm all right," Sterling said. Cody didn't move. "I'm all right," Sterling said again, quieter this time, and this time he meant it less. He'd served 22 years in the Army, 2 tours in Desert Storm, 1 in Bosnia. He'd learned a long time ago that the world wasn't fair, that good men got passed over, that the people who smiled at you in daylight were sometimes the ones who picked your pockets in the dark. He'd made his peace with that, or he thought he had. But there was something about standing in your dead father's living room and watching your brother pocket everything, watching him do it with that practiced look of humble satisfaction, like he'd earned it, that cracked something loose in Sterling's chest that he hadn't expected. His father, Eugene Webb, had been a rancher his whole life. 40 acres outside Clarkton, a small cattle operation, a reputation in town for being quietly stubborn and privately generous. He'd given to the church without telling anyone. He'd bought groceries for the Hendersons after their barn burned down in 1994 and never mentioned it. He was the kind of man people talked about at funerals, but not enough while he was alive. Sterling knew that. Sterling had always known that about him. What he hadn't known, what no one seemed to know, was what his father had done with the 40 acres he'd sold quietly in 2009 to a land developer who'd gone on to build a distribution center worth $200 million. Sterling pulled into his driveway in Millhaven, Iowa, just past midnight. He sat in the truck for a while with the engine off. Cody waited. "Come on then," Sterling said. Inside, he set the watch on the kitchen table and looked at it. It was ugly. The face was scratched. The band was cracked at both hinges, and the small silver clasp had been replaced at some point with a strip of electrical tape. His father had worn it every single day of his adult life. Sterling had seen it on his wrist at Christmas, at his mother's funeral, at Sterling's deployment ceremony in 1990. He'd assumed his father would be buried with it. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and sat down and picked up the watch. He turned it over in his hands the way a man does when he doesn't know what he's looking for. The leather backing was peeling at one corner. He pressed it flat, and that's when he felt it. A stiffness. A layer inside the layer. He set the bourbon down. It took him 10 minutes and a butter knife to work the panel loose without tearing it. And when he did, a small folded piece of paper fell onto the kitchen table. It was a handwritten note in his father's careful slanted print. "Sterling. There's a safety deposit box at First Midland Bank in Lincoln. Box 1141. The key is taped behind the mirror in my workshop. I didn't put this in the will because I didn't want lawyers deciding what to do with it. I wanted you to decide. You always knew the difference between what something was worth and what something cost. Your brother never did. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so." Dad Sterling read it twice. Then he sat very still for a long time. Cody came and lay down across his feet. He drove to Lincoln the next morning before the bank opened. He'd found the key exactly where the note said it would be, behind the old cracked mirror in his father's workshop, which had smelled like motor oil, and cedar shavings, which had smelled, Sterling realized with a sharp and unexpected ache, exactly like his father. He'd stood there for a moment with the key in his palm and not moved. First Midland Bank opened at 9. Sterling was in the parking lot at 8:40 with a coffee and Cody pacing circles in the truck bed. The safety deposit box was long and heavy. The bank manager, a young woman named Claire, who clearly had no idea what was about to happen, set it on the table in the small private room and left him alone with it. Inside were 3 envelopes, a USB drive, and a second handwritten letter. The first envelope contained a deed, not to the 40 acres. Those were sold, gone, legitimate. But to a separate parcel of land, 68 acres of timber and creek land in northeastern Nebraska, held in a family trust that his father had established in 1998 and never mentioned to anyone. The trust was in Sterling's name alone. The second envelope contained a statement from an investment account. Eugene Webb had opened it in 1991 and contributed to it quietly for 30 years. He'd never touched it. Compounding interest and a few carefully chosen index funds had turned modest contributions into something that made Sterling's hands go still on the paper. $3,200,000. The third envelope contained a letter from a Lincoln attorney named Harold Gaines, dated 8 months before Eugene's death. It outlined the full scope of what Eugene had put aside, confirmed the trust, confirmed the account, and explained that Eugene had specifically excluded these assets from the primary estate to ensure they went to Sterling directly, without contest, without the complications of probate. Your father was very clear about his intentions, the letter read. He said, and I am quoting him directly, "My older boy will know what to do with it. He spent his whole life serving other people. It's time somebody made sure he had something to stand on." Sterling sat in that small room for a long time. Claire knocked once to check on him, and he asked her for a glass of water, and she brought it and didn't ask questions. Cody was outside in the truck, and Sterling found himself wishing the dog was in the room with him, because the room was very quiet, and the quiet felt loud. He thought about the look on Brent's face the day before, that practiced humility, that careful, performed graciousness as the lawyer read off number after number. Sterling had watched his brother's wife squeeze Brent's hand, and he'd watched Brent nod slowly, like a man receiving his due. He thought about his father wearing that watch every single day for 40-something years. He thought about the workshop, and the mirror, and the fact that his father had put the key there, and trusted that Sterling would find it. Trusted that Sterling would look. His father had known him. That was the thing. His father had known him all along and had just, for reasons Sterling might never fully understand, not said so while he was alive. Sterling pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and took a long breath. Then he folded the letters back into their envelopes, put the USB drive in his shirt pocket, and stood up. He called Harold Gaines from the parking lot. Gaines was a careful, soft-spoken man in his late 60s who sounded like he'd been waiting for this call. He walked Sterling through everything methodically: the trust transfer timeline, the account access procedure, the deed filing for the timberland. He answered every question Sterling had and 2 questions Sterling hadn't thought to ask. "Your father came to me 3 times over 8 years, Gaines said at one point. Each time he added something. Each time he said the same thing at the end. He said, 'Harold, I want that boy to have something real.' That's what he said. Something real." Sterling was quiet for a moment. "Did he say anything else?" "He said you'd earned it, that you'd spent your whole career making sure other people got home safe, and that it was time someone returned the favor." Cody had climbed halfway out of the truck bed and was leaning against Sterling's arm. Sterling scratched the dog's ear without thinking about it. "What about Brent?" Sterling asked. "Your brother received his inheritance as documented in the primary will. These assets were deliberately excluded from that document. There is no legal avenue for him to contest what was never in the estate. Sterling nodded slowly. He hadn't asked the question hoping for a different answer. He'd asked it because he'd wanted to understand his father's thinking completely. Eugene Webb had not been a dramatic man. He hadn't set this up to punish Brent. He'd set it up to protect Sterling. Those were different things. "All right," Sterling said. "What do I need to sign?" Brent found out 11 days later. Sterling didn't tell him. He didn't have to. Small towns have their own kind of gravity, and Clarkton was a small town. And someone at the courthouse talked, the way someone always did. Brent called on a Tuesday afternoon, while Sterling was out in his backyard throwing a ball for Cody in the dry August heat. "Is it true?" Brent said. He didn't bother with hello. "Is what true?" Sterling said, though he knew. "That Dad had a separate account, that he left you land, that you went to Lincoln and—" Brent stopped. Sterling could hear him breathing. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It wasn't my information to share until the transfer was complete." Sterling. There was something in Brent's voice that Sterling had heard before. The particular tight quality of a man who has realized he got less than he thought and is deciding how to feel about it. "We're family, we are," Sterling agreed. "Dad left me everything. The house, the ranch, the account. He left you what was in the will," Sterling said carefully. "He left me what wasn't." The silence stretched. "He never told me," Brent said finally, and the anger in his voice had gone quieter, which somehow made it worse. $3 million, and he never said a word to me, to his own son." Sterling looked out at the yard. Cody had dropped the ball and was watching him, ears forward, reading the conversation the way he always did. "He said plenty to both of us," Sterling said, "just not always with words." Brent hung up. Sterling didn't sleep well the week after that call, and he told himself it was because of the heat, and he knew it was because of Brent. He and his brother had never been close. 15 years of different lives, different choices, a particular distance that had grown so gradually, neither of them had noticed until it was too wide to easily cross. But he was still his brother, his father's son, the only other person in the world who had sat in that house at Christmas and eaten that same food and known what the old man's laugh sounded like. He drove out to the timber property on a Thursday. 68 acres of mixed pine and hardwood following the bend of a creek that ran cold and clear even in August. He walked it slowly with Cody, ranging ahead through the underbrush, nose down, tail up, covering ground in the easy systematic way that reminded Sterling, not for the first time, that the dog had been trained by people who'd known what they were doing. Cody had come to him 3 years ago, through a veterans service animal program, retired from his working career due to a hip issue that had since resolved almost entirely on the back of good food and regular walks. He was 7 years old, and he moved through those Nebraska woods like he owned them. Sterling stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the water and thought about his father. Eugene Webb had bought this land in 1991. Sterling had been deployed in 1991. He'd never known the land existed, never seen it, never walked it. But his father had walked it, had looked at this same water, and thought, what? That someday his older son would be standing here, trying to figure out what to do with a piece of ground his whole family didn't know about. He'd thought something real enough to file a deed and establish a trust, and keep it quiet for 30 years. Sterling crouched down and let his hand rest in the current. The water was very cold. He thought about what his father had said to Harold Gaines, something real. He thought about the men he'd served with, the ones who'd come home sideways, who'd struggled with what came after. He thought about the veteran service program that had given him Cody, about the coordinator there, a woman named Ruth, who ran the whole operation out of a building that was too small, and a budget that was always too tight. He thought for a long time. Then he stood up and dried his hand on his jeans and called Ruth's number. "Sterling," she said, surprised. "Everything okay with Cody?" "Cody's perfect," he said. "I've got a different kind of question. I want to know what you'd do with 68 acres of timberland and enough money to build something on it. A pause. I'd want to know what you had in mind first, Ruth said. I was thinking a residential program, Sterling said, for veterans transitioning out, somewhere they could stay while they found their footing. With dogs, if you could work that in. Service animals, working with them, teaching them to train. He paused. I was thinking it could be called the Webb Center, after my father. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Sterling Webb, when can you come in and talk to me about this? He looked out at the creek. Cody had waded in up to his knees and was standing in the current watching the water the way dogs did, with complete and unself-conscious attention. Tomorrow, Sterling said. The groundbreaking was the following spring. On a cold April morning, with mud on the ground and a small crowd standing in it. Ruth had found 3 other veteran-focused nonprofits willing to partner on the project. A local construction firm had offered a 40% discount in exchange for the naming rights to the main dormitory. Harold Gaines had done the legal work for cost. Sterling stood at the back of the small crowd, which was where he always stood, and listened to Ruth speak about what the center was going to mean for families in transition. About the research showing what animals did for men and women who had trouble sleeping, trouble talking, trouble sitting still in rooms where no one understood what they'd done or where they'd been. He listened to her talk about his father without ever having met him, and he thought she'd gotten it exactly right. Cody was on his left. Brent was, unexpectedly, on his right. He'd shown up that morning without calling ahead, in a clean jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who didn't know if he was welcome, but had come anyway. Sterling had seen him cross the field and stood still and waited. When Brent reached him, they'd stood next to each other for a moment without speaking. Mom used to bring me out here when I was small, Brent said finally. I didn't know it was his until you told me. I didn't even recognize it. Neither did I, Sterling said. He was a strange man, Brent said. He was, Sterling agreed. I think he loved us, in a language we had to learn how to read. Brent looked at the ground. I shouldn't have said what I said on the phone. About family. You were upset, still. He was quiet. What you're doing with it is, it's good, Sterling. It's a good thing. Sterling didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. They stood there in the cold mud, the 2 sons of Eugene Webb. While Ruth finished her remarks and the small crowd clapped, and a photographer from the county paper took a picture of the ceremonial groundbreaking that ran on the front page the following week. In the photograph, Sterling is standing with one hand resting on Cody's head. He's not smiling for the camera. He's looking at something off to the left, the tree line, or the creek beyond it, or something no one else could see. He looks, according to several people who commented on the photo in the paper's online section, like a man who has finally put something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. On the drive home, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the watch. He'd had it repaired at a small shop in Lincoln. A watchmaker named Albert who'd worked on it for a week and called him when it was done with the kind of quiet, professional satisfaction that meant the job had been harder than he'd let on. The Elgin kept perfect time now. The band had been replaced with a brown leather strap that matched the original's color closely enough. Sterling slipped it onto his wrist at a red light. He held it there for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Cody watched him from the passenger seat. He knew what he was doing, Sterling said. Cody put his head down on the center console. Sterling drove home through the April afternoon with the window cracked and the smell of thawing ground coming in off the fields, and the watch on his wrist, keeping quiet, steady time, the way it had been doing all along, even when no one was listening.